can sure do that. First of all, it's a pleasure to be included, and I'm very grateful to Alice for having me. I mean, for being in London, I should really be in Belfast, but yesterday we were locked into an all-day away day, and that wasn't quite possible. So here we go. I want to talk today about the many challenges that the adoptees from Greece still face with focus on their identity and their citizenship rights. And I do this in light of the fact that the Greek-born adoptee history was actually not well known at all. You never see it mentioned in any book up until very recently, which is kind of startling when you think that 4,000 people are at stake. So this is a plea then for historians and researchers to really think, to also include the lesser known countries who send many adoptees overseas. And the typical question I first get, both from Greeks and others, is, was there even an adoptee movement from Greece? So we've literally gone anywhere from doing the hardcore research to awareness raising to now full-blown activism. All right. So I want to put some concepts out there that show a lot of similarities with the other adoptive movements. Rather than going to the very particulars of the Greek history, it's more useful for you to kind of approach it through terms that you recognize in other histories, other historic adoption movements just as well. So for Greece, this is a post-World War II phenomenon. That is actually when it comes on board, it is being discussed in 1948 first, and it is an entirely new phenomenon. There was a lot of kind of informal adoption or adoption within the village, within the greater family, but a phenomenon that sends children permanently overseas, sometimes very often to strangers, whereby ties with the birth family are cut. That is entirely a post-World War II phenomenon. And I immediately say that for Greece, it's also a Cold War phenomenon. And again, here we find lines of similarity with Korea, for instance. Greece was incredibly vulnerable in the aftermath of the Second World War. In fact, Greece went through a very devastating civil war from 46 through 49. Which was actually won by the right-wing Greek government with a very anti-communist retaliation plan, and that victory was only possible through American resources. So you immediately see just what kind of a Cold War landscape we are in which especially northern Greece is the very hot front of what we tend to call the Cold War. So the first adoptions then will be children who have been orphaned during both wars, the Second World War and the Civil War, and who have Greek-American relatives, typically in the US. They go to relatives. These are then the relative adoptions. But relatives is a broadly defined concept in the Greek world. Your remote village compatriot can still be kind of dubbed a relative. This is a society in which everyone is a cousin, remember? So from those relative adoptions, we will soon, by 1955, move to stranger adoptions, whereby unknown children go to unknown parents, very often through proxy adoptions, which means they are so strangers to each other that they actually literally meet at the airport in New York. That also brings with it that very dangerous concept that the child will arrive as a blank slate, ready to be formed by American society, in which it presumably will assimilate without any problems. I'm being a bit flippant here. So we talk, of course, of sending and receiving countries. Greece has not been known as a sending country in a history that lasts from about the 1950s, full-blown, through 1975. If I tell Greeks this today, there's a certain annoyance, a certain shame in this fact. Today, Greece is actually a receiving country. So Western European countries are adopting in, but of course the US is in the lead also in this post-war adoption movement. The second biggest taker of Greek children will be the Netherlands, which took about 600 children. The third one will be Sweden with about 50 children. The Korean adoptees are, of course, most visible in this post-war wave. But I have to come back, and I will qualify that in a minute, that Greece predates the Korean adoptee movement, which we typically place in 1953. Greece has already sent several hundreds of children by 1953, even though in the history books, that's not how it goes down to this day. So lots of investigations are going on in the historic adoptions. The Netherlands has done beautiful work investigating 65 years of its adoption history. Sweden is on it. Ireland, of course, has been in the forefront. The UK, Switzerland, Belgium, France. The US still has some work to do. I'm trying to push Greece, will certainly has some work to do. Of course, we need to see the whole gamut of these adoptions from Greece. In the beginning, there is a real crisis. There is a real emergency. The civil war has left many children without a family. There is a need for humanitarian intervention. But by 1955, about that changes. And then we see the demand for younger children, babies, white children, let's also say that, racist demands of the 1950s that people actually don't even hide, the demand for white available young children, and Greece is willing to comply and send over those children. And sure enough, that demand will outstrip the supply, and that's why by the late 1950s we enter into an era of irregularities, some scandals, talk of stolen babies, and certainly evidence of what is forced consent, uninformed consent, illiterate mothers, families who do not understand the actual legal repercussions of what they are signing. So my study has been to go after the files, after the primary source materials, but also after the documents that show interaction with social workers, the stories of young unwed mothers, and of course, occasionally we come upon unethical practices, although I must say those are not the majority. I don't want to make this history of 4,000 stolen babies, even though sometimes in the press, when I say 4,000 adoptions, the next thing that is published, it says 4,000 stolen babies. I'm very, very reluctant to jump on that bandwagon but I'm much more comfortable with the idea of forced consent. So yes, there are archival sources, hard to come by, and of course in Greece, very restricted by the personal data protection. And the Ministry of Foreign Affairs does its own bit of gatekeeping. Technically, it should be very easy to reconstruct all the orphan visas and all the passports that were issued. In practice, that is impossible. The best informants are the adoptees themselves, right now in the around, aged 65, 70, 75. They've shared willingly with me papers, pictures, memoirs, and of course, emotions, very often with a sense that this is the history that, because it was so unknown, because it has never been recognized, because Greece itself doesn't even know about it, and certainly the government hasn't recognized it, that they've been dealing with these emotions for decades for themselves, and that a history book a book of the documenting the history, as I published in 2019, could finally become the vehicle to discover that they're not alone, which is a big deal, and that their emotions are valid. I also find informants among the birth families fewer and fewer. Birth parents have typically already died. Adoptive parents have most certainly already died. They were a little older when they adopted to begin with, and then the mediators have all disappeared. So I'm really kind of plugging away in a void where oral sources are very hard to come by. But I can, of course, go after newspaper records, uh, uh, minutes of meetings, bilateral agreements, in addition then to the sources of family members, siblings typically remembering. And I want to make a little plug for serendipity, the absolute unmethodological embracing of what comes to you by straight, undeserved luck through the kindness of strangers and colleagues. I'm very open to that aspect of my research because the biggest gold nuggets of research have actually come to me through people's kindness, and I want to encourage that. I also use every book presentation as a gateway to discover more sources. Typically, when I give a talk in Greece, there is always somebody in the audience who will come up to me afterwards and have a personal story to tell. I want to allow for that. What we say in public, what gets recorded, is very much a draw for people to kind of get a sense of how we work and then feel encouraged to work with us. And out of my intense work with hundreds of Greek-born adoptees has indeed blossomed an activism for what I call the 3 Rs: records, research, and restored citizenship. This is then action research in which I now engage after having written the history, which comes with its own moral and ethical responsibilities, and certainly with an obligation to be confidential, to use pseudonyms, even though I meet very many adoptees who are done with the pseudonyms and want their name to be known with every opportunity. So a little bit about the logistics and the numbers of the movements in which this historic adoption traffic from Greece takes place. Between 1950 and 1970, Greece sends about 4,000 children to the US. They come from institutions all over Greece, but quite a few come from unwed birth mothers or married couples who are in distress, poverty, in other words, and decide to give up children, to then regret it for a lifetime. After the first scandal breaks out in 1959, Greece doesn't stop its adoption movement. It actually diverts it to a country that is less perceived as the imperialist takeover, associated with the US, and they quietly send 600 children to the Netherlands. They come all from one institution with branches throughout Greece. So in a way, their search is easier because it repeats itself multiple times over. The procedure is uniform, whereas in the first phase, the procedure is literally all over the place. And it very much depends on the mediator whether there are even any records at all in existence. And then there are those 50 children to Sweden. After that, some children end up in Canada, Australia, Switzerland, but those are smaller numbers. And it doesn't surprise us that in the patriarchal Greek society of the mid-20th century, the children for adoption are most often girls. There is indeed what we call a missing girl phenomenon. Demographically, there should be more girls in Greek society. Statistically, that is not the case. Girls are also most in demand, so that is why the demand and supply here parallel each other. Today, and this is kind of a strange observation, the people active in writing about this and speaking to journalists and putting out their memoirs are mostly the female adoptees. We have very few men in our midst who take active, are equally active. People have, especially the children of an older age, such as the girl in the cover of this book, which is a personal memoir, who was 10 years old when she traveled, have a very keen sense of uprooting disruption. They remember a family, they remember a village, they remember their cousins, they remember playing by the sea, they remember foods, religion, customs, and they have lost their language, which they perceive as a huge loss, especially since Greek is hard to recuperate afterwards. So to have been a native speaker once and now hardly having the tools of being able to communicate with siblings is something that they perceive as a huge loss. And we don't often register that enough when we talk about international adoptions. So, like with the Korean adoptions, a big landmark, a big watershed date is the American Refugee Relief Act from 1953. And it really also provides a watershed in the Greek adoptions. There is a before and there is an after. And as with the Korean adoptions, we see that ultimately the needs of a country are almost secondary to the opening or closing doors of the American immigration law provisions. So more than 1,000 children travel from Greece to the US before 1953. And this is why I call again the Greek historic adoption movement the first mass organized adoption movement. It precedes, with those numbers, it precedes the Korean movement, and it also precedes the little, the trickle of Irish children going to the US for the main reason that I emphasize the words mass organized adoption movement, not individual cases. So before the 53, then we see mainly older children traveling, very often sibling groups. Very often there is a male child that will be welcomed by his uncle who runs a restaurant in Pittsburgh who needs some helping hands. And this is some sort of an relative adoption arrangements. The children travel by boat. They arrive in Hoboken, New Jersey, and the whole first phase of this Greek adoption movement very much bears characteristics of an extended family migration movement, or at least, family members or village members assisting in the raising of what are typically orphan children from the Civil War. But that changes very quickly. After 1953, we see a demand for younger children, infants, who now go to stranger families. And among the families who adopt massively from Greece, you will recognize the pattern of US military families adopting, very common, deeply religious families adopting, very common. In families in Texas, that may strike you as odd, but there was one very active Greek priest in Texas who functioned as some sort of a self-made social service and single-handedly arranged 80 to 90 adoptions, which is why Texas kind of ranks disproportionately high. Jewish families in New York have quite a preference for Greek children, mainly because they fit in. This is a community that is trying to reestablish its numbers, especially after the devastating Holocaust, and they think of children from Greece as fitting in and raising no questions for people who are uncomfortable with their own infertility, for instance. But one thing runs through all these families adopting. These children go to white, heterosexual, married couples. And the arrivals after 53 tend to be by plane, and that gives us extra documentation because the flight records exist. And through Ancestry.com, one can study them. And we see immediately entire flight patterns develop. The actual logistics of travel are fascinating to me and show a level of organization and a level of competitiveness and a level of cost cutting that is quite startling. These children are not immediately American citizens, of course, they have to be naturalized. And we all hope that their adoptive parents took the trouble of naturalizing their citizens, because otherwise we all know what trouble they're in today. Typically 2 years go by before that naturalization can happen. Children are welcome. On adults from Greece would rest the stigma that maybe they're communists trying to sneak in, about which there was a huge scare. But children children kind of go under the radar of that surge for communists and crypto-communists under the McCarthy regime. These naturalizations of little foreign children make the newspaper, and here is such an article, They're American Now. The rhetoric in the meantime of war orphans continues. In Greece, the war has ended in 49. These children will still be called war orphans all through the early 60s, and we know that actually both terms are wrong. First of all, the war has ended. Secondly, most of them traveling in a later phase are not orphans. They have a living mother, a living unwed mother, but a mother who was not given a chance to properly raise her child. So here is where an interesting comparison with Korea comes in. If we study the statistics, and I rely now on US immigration statistics, which are pretty widely published and actually more reliable than the Greek statistics. Between 49 and 62, adopted children from Greece coming to the US stand at a number of 3,200, compared to adopted children from Korea, where the number stands at just over 4,000. And here's where I need to make an important point that really startles people who study the Korean movement. You would immediately say that the Korean number is, in absolute terms, the higher number. Of course, I have to agree. It's higher by about 1,000. But, and here's the big but, Korea has about 4 times the population of Greece at this time. And let that sink in. 4 times the population of Greece. That means if we work proportionally now, according to population numbers, the ratio of children departing from Greece to the US is much higher than the ratio of children from Korea up until 62. After that, it changes dramatically, with Korea solidly in the lead for many years. This is startling for other reasons as well, because, in Korea, we know that there were children of American soldiers. In Greece, there are not. So those are all, there is no reason why Greece should outrank Korea by such a long stretch if factors such as the so-called mixed race children don't even play. This was also the focus of the first celebrity adoptions. Here is Danny Kaye with Orphans on the Acropolis. Greek children are, as the literature and the advertisements mention, white. Even though in the early 20th century, Greeks would not have been entirely white in American society. And there is, of course, as you see in the picture, the prestige of ancient Greece. It's quite strategically positioned to put Danike in front of the Parthenon, of course. Here's what always strikes me. These adoptees are meant to be a blank slate when they first arrive. They're supposed to not carry any history, so that they supposedly will assimilate and only be American, nothing else. But when they are allowed to carry a history, it has to be the prestigious history of ancient Greece, not the traumatic history of the 1940s Greece. So in a way, they're credited with a historical pedigree for the prestige of it, but certainly not allowed to have the history that comes with trauma. So who are then the mediators? The first one who sets this all up and delivers the blueprint and is already talking about these adoptions in 1948 and making the first negotiations is a Greek-American organization. You could compare that, for instance, to a Catholic organization in Italy. So there's definitely an ethnic volunteer component there, but this group is less steeped in religion or religious fervor than, for instance, certain Catholic movements in Ireland or in Italy. I emphasize that because the kind of repressive Catholic institution in Greece does not exist. Some people of these organizations kind of see an opportunity to develop their own business within the movement. The names appear there. Some people develop their specific clienteles. Here is Father Diavatis in Texas and his one-man show. Of course, the ISS is in the picture, working internationally and actually doing, at some point, Greek adoptions alongside Korean adoptions with similar procedures, similar attacks on proxy adoptions, a similar effort to implement the role of the caseworker, do home studies. In Greece, this is a very hard-fought battle. In fact, until about the early 60s, the ISS is ISS's practices are pretty much frowned upon by the first organization, which finds, the use of a social worker a total luxury and would rather see faster procedures that they can kind of monopolize rather than the slow procedures of the ISS, which also insists that the child is adopted in the US after a probation period. And that doesn't go over too well either. And then there's a Queen's Foundation called the Baby Center Mitera. The connection of the Queen is often suspected by the Greeks, but she comes in later. And then there are people such as travel agents who just kind of try their hand at adoptions and make a disaster out of it. I've found lots of good material in American newspapers. The local newspapers, such as these from Texas or Oregon or Iowa, write about orphan arrivals, Greek orphan arrivals, also about Korean orphan arrivals or German orphan arrivals for that matter. But how they write about them is very interesting to me in terms of the mentality of the time. Greece is a disaster country. There is partisan strife. There is poverty. There's not even heat or clothing. The best thing that can happen to a child is that the boy will be a Texan in no time at all. So leave it all behind, start fresh with a new lease on life in the US is the message. A kind of self-serving, self-aggrandizing message of the American as the savior of these poor little unfed children. And then, of course, the Greek child is totally fascinated by all the comfort appliances and gadgets, and of course, the comfort foods. And hygiene is, of course, an American invention, in case we didn't know, because the Greek child has never seen a bath or a comb or a toothbrush. It's just incredible to me that newspapers get away with this kind of language, even as late as 1959. But newspapers also give away a little bit of the red flags. So a couple here says that they've tried to adopt domestically in the US, but they were rejected. So they say proudly, we sidestepped child welfare obstacles and tried Europe, and they get their Greek child. So we see a lot of parents who have been rejected by social services in the US negotiate an adoption from Greece, which goes through without a glitch. In fact, to this date, and I've seen very, very many adoption decrees, to this date, I've only ever seen one rejection, which means it's pretty much rubber stamping. There is some paperwork involved, but always with the certainty that the adoption will go through. Oh, sorry. We see a consumerist approach in this movement. Adoptive parents specify what they want. They want a blonde and blue-eyed girl, which means white, and then they'll settle for a dark-haired and dark-eyed girl as long as it's white. That's that, and they're quite open about that in their correspondence. They commodify the child. There's quite a lot of negotiation. There's, some adoptions break up in the middle of the process because the child isn't healthy or there's an issue. They want value for their money. And occasionally they return the faulty product on that basis that they were kind of deceived and they feel that they have the right to return the child. What happens to that child then is rather sad. The child ends up in an American institution or find a new pair of parents, typically in a hurry, somewhat hastily, which means with even less of a screening than we've seen before. And certainly, so not only is the screening faulty, but the follow-up is traditionally faulty in all cases. There's a whole lot of economic factors that come into play here. Money exchanges hands, the logistics of how that money travels, the logistics of how the children travel, who the lawyers are, the networks of lawyers. All of that is of very much interest to me because it really kind of grabs the movers and shakers of Greek society at the time. But I'm not going to bother you with that. Of course, these practices of the consumerist approach, the commodification, the money exchanges should raise questions about today's commercial surrogacy. And I pity the generations who will be equally hard in search of their roots as the adoptees that I meet are today. And I just hope that intercountry adoption can deliver a message to all the people in the field of commercial surrogacy, that we haven't heard the voices yet of those who had most at stake. So yes, protections like the Hague Convention comes in for Greece, but by the time that has happened, it's too little too late. Greece knows about this adoption traffic. This is a cartoon from 1959 in the newspaper, and you see one of Greece's leading politicians pretty much, asking for American investment from this guy who looks like a Texas businessman with the exchange of babies in cargo crates. So Greece puts a tremendous amount of harsh truths in cartoon form. And if you find such a nugget, it really kind of says it all. But it does mean that there was awareness, the kind of awareness in the late 1950s that Greece then lost for about 50 years. So when people speak for themselves, they tend to speak of uprooting, deception, lies, money transactions. These are self-published memoirs, of which the first one appeared in 2011, and ever since there has been a growing movement among the adoptees to speak with their own voices, which are very much encouraged. You can see that the cover of the last one is really quite blunt in terms of, money goes to Greece for baby that comes from Greece. The middle one is in Dutch and says, a chest full of secrets, by the Greek-born woman who holds the chest that contains the bones of her biological mother. 14 Greek-born adoptees got together and published a volume called Voices of the Lost Children of Greece, which just came out. Mary Kardaras, herself an adoptee, was the one who led the project, and she is also the author of this adoption novella called Ripped at the Roots. And I especially like the cover of this book, A Son from the Mountains, where the handwriting of the mother is overlaid with the official language of the Greek passport and the author's baby picture. So forced consent is the central concept in this movement. Birth mothers don't actually choose, they hardly consent, they hardly choose. Social workers, if they're at all in the picture, really are not there to present options. They immediately think adoption, especially when the child is illegitimate, which is a huge taboo in Greece of the 50s and the 60s. The welfare infrastructure is underdeveloped, but it's also not Greece's priority, because according to its Cold War obligations, it's actually at all times more heavily investing in military hardware than in welfare. So there are always do-gooders on the scene who take advantage of uneven power relationships and will to this day claim that everything was done for humanitarian reasons, even when correspondence and other rather compromising evidence shows otherwise. Birth mothers today will agree that they signed, but no, they did not realize the consequences, or they did not realize that this would be a lifetime of trauma. There was the shame of being an unwed pregnant mother, and now onto that is added the shame of having given up the child. In the end, that is the shame of an entire country of having let 4,000 people go for whom it did not provide sufficiently. I come too late in this history to hope for birth mother activism. And that is where the Greek movement distinguishes itself rather sharply from other movements. There are hardly any birth mothers alive. If we find them, and occasionally we do, they are 85 to 95. They are still carrying the shame. They have no desire to speak in public, or no desire to start demonstrating, or signing a document or a petition or anything. Most birth mothers have actually taken their secret to their grave. So what are these 3 R's then? This is my last slide. The 3 R's are supposed to bring the redress of what was indeed a baby drain. Greece always talks of a brain drain, and that's why I play on the idea of a baby drain. People want access to their records. That sounds basic. In Greece, that is still an uphill battle. Some organizations collaborate, other organizations do not. We've knocked on many doors. We've talked to the government. We've talked to the watchdogs over the government. We've talked to the president of Greece. Some records are still closed, or they will be so considered so sensitive that they cannot be shared. This flaunts, this goes against the laws, but it seems to also, by the time to actually get the law applied or to do a lawsuit to get the records, that is a different kind of question, because for a whole lot of people, we're running out of time. Some adoptees have now started to think about a lawsuit. Unfortunately, a lawsuit will typically take 5 years. That means there will be fewer and fewer beneficiaries of this opening of the records, and one has to kind of weigh what is strategically most advantageous for most people. I'm more of a believer in diplomacy and working behind the scenes, so I'm not part of the lawsuit, but in the end, it will be the result that counts. I would like to see more research, some sort of a historical study on the model of the Netherlands, and I would be very eager to be a participant in that. Greece has not shown any indication of launching that. And then a request that is very prominent among the adoptees is that they would like to see their Greek citizenship restored as a second citizenship. This is a bigger issue than you might think. It's really a huge desire for having part of their identity restored and for some sort of a symbolic recognition by their home country that this even happened. Because maybe the biggest art of all might well be recognition through this symbolic restoration of citizenship.